Welcome to Cooking the Books. I'm Frances Cook. If you wanted to find out if New Zealanders are financially resilient, then 2020 was one heck of a trial by fire to keep an eye on. Well, the Financial Services Council has done just that, spending the year tracking how we're all doing in response to one of the most significant challenges of our times. Some of the results of their Financial Resilience Index are a little surprising. New Zealanders have stayed reasonably financially confident through the year. Despite the madness, more of us have decided to give things like investing a try, which you might think is chaotic timing, but actually makes sense when you think about this year as a wake-up call and the need to make sure we're looking out for ourselves. Less good, but not at all surprising, is the increase in people worrying about job security. That went from 30% of us in March to almost 50% in both April and August. Overall, money worries also weren't great, with more people saying it was on their mind and impacting things like their physical and mental health. So, what should we make of all of this information? And is there a way we can guard against the quite reasonable worries?
Newstalk ZB presents Cooking the Books with Frances Cook.
I'm joined now by Richard Clippen, CEO of the Financial Services Council. Now, of course, COVID created this huge time of uncertainty, and I think particularly for our money. In New Zealand, we were lucky enough to be mostly worried about our money. And you were monitoring how people were feeling throughout 2020. So what were the biggest changes that you noticed coming through in the data?
Hi, Francis, and great to join you this morning. The way New Zealanders think and feel about money was something that we were really interested in, and we actually made a decision late last year to go in field and understand what a good research sample was doing. Funnily enough, we actually went into field just before COVID, so and this was in early March. We were all, if we all reflect back to the way it was before, we were all blissfully living our lives thinking, it is the way it is. But of course, going into research and into field in early March, there was the early indications of something big and something substantive and something painful was going to happen. So we kind of got some baseline data, which we didn't really realize at the time. But we then, once we went into lockdown and we start to see the data, we start to go, we've got some really interesting and reflective insights into how New Zealanders think about their jobs, about their wealth, about their broader mental health, about their financial outlook. And so what we decided to do was to then go back in field a couple more times and to see what shifted and what changed. So yeah, really interesting, really interesting piece of research.
Yeah, and I've got to say, of all the years to start, this data set seems, I am sure there's a lot of work that went into it, but in some ways it seems very lucky in the timing of it and the sorts of questions that you were asking. It's incredibly relevant. One thing that really stood out to me, and I think this is probably not that unexpected, but that more of us have been worrying about money this year, and there have been people saying there's been impacts on things like their physical and mental health. And I think money is such a core thing that impacts so many other areas of our lives. That is, I think, perfectly reasonable. But also unexpected emergencies will happen, not necessarily always a pandemic. But, there is weird stuff that happens in life all the time. I mean, is there a good way to prepare for whatever the next weird thing might be?
So, Francis, really interesting. Just back to your earlier comment, right, which is the thing about money is it's actually not about money. Money is just a utilitarian thing that helps us, buy stuff or do stuff or whatever. But actually, money is not the object. It's what it does for us. It's what we can do with it. It's how we can live the lives that we want to lead. And so, one of the pieces of research that came out of the data set was money and you. It's not about the money, it's about you, because people have this kind of fundamental relationship with money that starts very early on in life. And what we wanted to try and kind of unpack is, how do people think about money, and where do you get your earliest lessons from? Because if you learn those lessons early, we actually thought about it as a language. in the same way that if you go to another country and you don't speak Italian or you don't speak Greek, it's a whole lot harder to get around when you go traveling. Well, money is very much the same thing. If you get the language of money, it's a whole lot easier to get around. And so that informs the decisions you make and the way you think about, building wealth and the connection of wealth it really into your headspace and to your mental well-being and all of those kind of things. So that was some of the most powerful pieces that we got. And it reflected itself in the research by early on, it was quite clear that New Zealanders on average only had about 3 months of savings, that if something happened, something really dramatic happened, that they could last for 3 months before something would have to give, something substantive would have to give. And so this notion of a rainy day, or in this case, a pandemic day, was around saying stuff happens. You've got to be prepared for when stuff goes bad, and hope that it doesn't. But if it does, you're very well protected. And that became a savings conversation. It became an investment conversation. It became about where do you keep your wealth and build your wealth, and then on the flip side is how do you make sure that you stay healthy, because in the end that's what allows us to do all the things that we want to do, our physical health and our mental health.
I think that is such a good point about saying it's like a language, and if you don't know the language, it's going to be so much harder to get around. Because I think a really common criticism that I've seen around is people saying, oh, managing money isn't that hard, you just learn a few things and then you do it, which to a certain extent I agree with. I think it doesn't have to be hard managing your money, but when you feel excluded and you don't understand what people are talking about and you don't understand the words being used, it can be intimidating just to even look at it, right?
So totally. We're in the middle of a housing boom, and the language of money is on one hand really simple, but on the other hand really complex. Just take houses for a moment. New Zealanders have come out of the pandemic because of phenomenal collective political and community leadership, so that we face the end of the year with the freedoms that many others don't have. And so it's triggered a boom because there's interest rates have come under 3%. But if you're going to buy a house, well, what should you do? Should you fix your rate and float your rate, do some of it, take a long-term view, a short-term view? I mean, these are substantive decisions to make. And if you don't know your way around, and I suppose this is the other piece of the research, right? If you don't know your way around, when you travel into Italy or to Greece or wherever, well, you find a guide, don't you? You get someone to help you on your journey, whether it's your favorite website, your favorite app, or your financial advisor or whatever. But this notion of getting good input so you can make good decisions, whilst it's really simple on the one hand, it's also really complex on the other hand. And the research found, really strongly, that plays out differently at different stages of life. In other words, if you're someone 5 years out from retirement and you see your asset base take a serious shock because markets, hit a brick wall, well, that changes the way you think about what kind of retirement you want to have and what savings you may need. And it's very different at the other end of life when you're in your teens and starting out with your first corner job, serving ice creams or, pulling petrol or whatever it is. And so that generational stuff also played out really, really differently through the research.
Very true. Different stages of life you're going to handle your money totally different. And I think with that caveat in mind that everyone's money is different, priorities are different, life stages are different. So with that disclaimer out there, are there certain things that New Zealanders in general should be prioritizing in order to increase their financial resilience, or to put it in a slightly different way, just the ability to get through these sudden shocks that can come out of nowhere? And I personally think we should always be prepared for, the old hope for the best, prepare for the worst. What are some simple things people could do to prepare?
Yeah, well, the notion is twofold. One is it's not how much you earn, it's actually what you do with it. So, people with really good savings habits, if you talk to, depending on what your age is, your parents or your grandparents, and kind of understand what happened, way back last century, when there were serious crises, and if you can go even further back, to Second World War, frugality, the lack of credit. You can't have something until you have the money aside. All of these things, which to some people is like, what are you talking about? That sounds like so last century. So what you do with your money becomes important, and so savings habits are so important to start young. Thinking about what you actually want and what you actually need, and separating those things out become really important. Understanding your cash flow. So whatever money's coming in, where does it go? Do you know where it goes? Because the other thing about the psychology, if you like, of money is that in the good old days before COVID, if you had real cash in your hand or in your wallet, you let it go a whole lot with a whole lot more reticence than just waving a card or doing an internet transaction. And so one of the challenges we've got, and our kids will have, our grandkids will have, is we're probably going to be in a cashless society. So all these things are just bits of numbers floating around on apps or on internet sites. And so we collectively have to help people think, actually this is real money that comes from somewhere. You probably had to work really hard to get there. And so, those are kind of 2 or 3 key tips. Understand where it's coming from, understand where it's going, have a budget, treat it with great respect. It's not an unlimited resource unless you're in the very, very lucky few, but even then. And then that takes care of your savings part. The next step is, how do you create wealth? That's the investing side. And that's about actually understanding how assets appreciate. So that's the property conversation and the KiwiSaver conversation, the shares conversation, and so on. And then the third step is understand your risks. Life doesn't always go well. We live in, one of the pieces of research we did last year, we live in a land of earthquakes and fires and volcanoes and so on. So risk is all around us. And so stuff happens. And so managing risk is the conversation around insurance. It's a conversation about, do you take it on, or do you offset it, or do you save it enough? So I think those 3 buckets of activities are really important for people to consider. And it often feels daunting, but if you just do small steps, small baby steps usually works out well.
Yeah, and I think exactly that, what you just ended on, is there might be some, if you're coming into money for the first time and this year has given you a fright and you feel like you don't know where to start, you do not have to get everything from the beginning. Even, when you said about you need to know what's coming in and going out. And one piece of advice that I've heard repeated over and over again is to have a money diary, even just for a week, where you write down everything that you spend for a week, because it's weird how writing things down changes the way that we approach them. And it is this terribly trite saying of what gets tracked gets changed. But the reason that everyone says it is that it is true. And if you write everything down, you don't necessarily have to get rid of all the treats, but there's going to be things in your money diary that you look at and you think, I didn't even necessarily enjoy that. And I certainly didn't need to have it. So that can go. And then all of a sudden you've got more money for saving. Obviously, it's easier if you have more money, but like you say, we hear about rappers going broke all the time. You can spend any amount of money. It will be more difficult if you're on a lower income, but there are still places you can find it, I think, to create some sort of financial security for yourself, even if it's less. And I think it's important, right? It's peace of mind.
Yeah, and that peace of mind piece is, that's in the end what the research found. If you manage your money life, then your well-being, how you feel about achieving things, your confidence and so on, is massive. And the reverse is true as well, and that was one of the insights from the research is, early on there was so much uncertainty. The biggest shift in our data was people thinking about their jobs, and would they lose them? And of course, if you lose your job, you lose your ability to earn an income, which then has your trigger-on effect. So the job security piece and the money piece was so critical in the well-being piece. And that's why, when we came out of lockdown, and the government subsidies that turned up really helped cushion the shocks. The other interesting thing about the COVID experience, of course, is, and this is the money diary conversation that you mentioned, if you track where it's coming and where it's going, well, of course, when we went to lockdown, fundamentally we couldn't spend on anything other than on the internet, and even that was, it was hard. But basics like food, fruit, vegetables, utilities, and so on. So that discretionary spend, hey, I'm walking past the shop, I'm going to go out for a meal, I'm going to buy something, almost stopped. And interestingly, we saw people hold on to a whole lot more money, which of course played out right across the economy. And so there were businesses that really, really, really struggled because people weren't spending. But if you just go into the family unit or the household unit and go, wow, what did I miss when I was locked down for 4 months? That now that I'm out of lockdown, I actually know maybe I'll have, instead of 4 of them, I'll have 3 of them a week. Like the coffees, your basic, $5 or $6. If you have 3 a day, that's 15 to 18. If you have 2 a day, it's a whole lot less. If you have 1 a day. And so if you then said, well, that's $6 a day that I'm not going to have a coffee, I'm going to do X with it, save it, put it away, put it into KiwiSaver or whatever. So that real or rethinking, reprioritization was kind of really interesting that we also saw come through the research.
And I think a point you made earlier about swiping cards, because there's been so much research done about the pain of handing over money is really important for helping you to be able to budget, to save. Handing over actual notes and money is more painful to our little monkey brains than swiping a card. And I've seen various different bits of research on this, but I've seen anywhere from using a card can make you spend anywhere from 70 to 100% more than you would have otherwise, which I think is so interesting. And this really relates into creating that financial certainty for yourself in terms of the job security. I think it's totally reasonable that people responded to this year and were a bit freaked out about their jobs. I think that's entirely rational. Personally, I reacted to that stress and worry by making sure I kept my cash savings high and I wasn't getting into any debt. I don't like debt anyway, but I definitely wasn't this year. And I think those are 2 things that were within my control, and that made me feel so much more secure and comfortable for whatever might happen this year. I mean, what sort of financial preparation do you think is needed? Does it change if you're worried about your job?
Yeah, totally. I mean, unless people have got lots of assets generating other income, then people's ability to work, people's ability to earn an income is the number one driver of that kind of sense of confidence about the future. And so if you don't have that, or it's uncertain, it puts it makes it really difficult on all the other decisions. And a lot of spending, the whole thing about money, it's kind of this trust idea. So the whole thing about jobs and spending is about, do you trust that the future will be good? Because if you do, then I will go forth and buy, whatever it is that people will buy. And in many ways, you can see the housing, I won't call it boom, but
it feels a bit like one, to be honest.
Yeah, that kind of whole momentum around what's going on in the housing market is a vote of confidence, not only in the economic settings, so in lower interest rates and so on, and how much demand supply is, but a sense of confidence in the future. Because if you think the future is going to be good, then you will happily make investment decisions today. And of course, there are some tips and traps in that, and you kind of get into these hubris and bubble ideas. The stock markets. Will these things always go up? Is it true to say that stock A or stock B will always increase, or property A and property B will always increase? Well, if you have that belief and it doesn't happen, then that's some of the behavior that we saw. In late March, early April, when stock markets globally reflected what was happening in COVID, you saw the whole market come off 20-30%. And interestingly, the behavior, particularly around the KiwiSaver marketplace, was that there was an element of the community who've never seen a crash before, basically went, I'm scared, I'm out of here, and they sold out of anything that was market linked, a stock or a share or property, and they went to cash in the hope that they would protect the downside. And of course, it's completely sensible behaviour. However, in the long term, it's a very expensive piece of behaviour, particularly now that we're sitting at the end of 2020 and markets have recovered and then some. And so people, what you do in the heat of the moment, it's this left brain, right brain. What's your greatest driver? And fear is a huge driver when it comes to money. And so people will make, hugely important decisions, and completely understand that. Been a really amazing case study this year of all things around money and psychology, for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've only had KiwiSaver for just over 10 years now. So for many people, this would be the most significant market crash they've ever experienced. And boy, was it a big one. And like you say, those emotional decisions, I often think that just anytime you're feeling an emotion is absolute kryptonite for your money, because you can't think straight. And so a lot of people sold when the market was down because they were fearful, and then had to buy back in when it had bounced back up. So you've basically, by being fearful, you have made a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have ended up losing money, which is such a shame. But the other end of it, of course, is that your data picked up something that I've been hearing from other areas too, is that for other people, they decided now was the good time to start investing. And they thought that we're going to give it a crack. We're going to jump in, some of them for the first time. And so we've seen investing activity actually increase over the course of 2020.
Yeah.
Did that surprise you?
It's amazing. You're exactly right. For all people who do it tough, there are others who will take the advantage and the opportunity. And so that's kind of true of most things, but certainly in investment situation. So what we saw was almost an unleashing of a new generation of investors who had time, because we're in lockdown, had an interest. And probably the big change through this market crash is that the availability of platforms and technology to actually execute, find research and so on has just been amazing. And so, there are a lot of fantastic New Zealand innovative companies doing stuff in this space. I'll just use Sharesies and Invest Now as a couple of good examples. But there's a generation of kids and adults who have jumped onto these platforms and are investing in, I'll have half a Tesla share or half an Apple share. So it's not just buying the NZX, but you can buy globally. And the volumes, the significant volumes, it's not just little blip volumes. It's like we went 200-300% more than we thought we would have in terms of volumes in some of these platforms. So that's really good, because I kind of go back to the language of money. Small anecdote of one, my 19-year-old who just finished school and is heading to university next year was one of those kids who jumped on and set up an account. And so, not that he's not interested in what he does with his money, but he was really interested to actually talk about some of the experiences that he had and the use of the technology. And did you know they found some new battery technology? And what does that mean for a Tesla share or any battery developer? So those kind of things are making the topic of money and the language of money much more accessible, much more interesting. And then because you can actually execute and use some really interesting app tools and tracking how you're going, it's just been one of the great surprises, and one of the really good upsides of this COVID year is a lot more people are interested, a lot more people are engaged, a lot more people got into the KiwiSaver conversation as well, just back to that earlier point, because people want to know, hey, I've got all this money, what's happening to it? And then, of course, just to the motive conversation that we had, again, you use the great word kryptonite. If you get emotional about money, you can often make bad decisions. So what we start to see is that call rates into call centers went up tremendously. The role of financial advisors went up tremendously because people wanted to soundboard, they wanted to get advice, they wanted to understand, and then they wanted to make good, balanced decisions. And that's also really healthy as we went through a really tough time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've got to say, I find it fascinating. I mean, a 19-year-old getting into shares investing, I think that is so wonderful. I think I started when I was 27 or 28, and an extra 10 years of compounding would be incredible, even if it was just from the little cafe jobs that I used to do. That would have been amazing.
Yeah.
And it's, of course, I mean, this podcast has been going, what, about 4 years now? And even in that time, we've seen such differences. I think Invest Now did exist when I started this podcast, but I had Sharesies on for one of their first interviews when they first started. I had Hatch on, and these are actually really new developments within New Zealand, that it has been so easy to start investing, and for such small amounts, you know, $1, $5. It's made it accessible, and it's made it much less intimidating as well, that even if the market's going crazy, if you're putting in $20, it's a little less terrifying, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the message, right? You know, we launched some research last week, and one of the biggest barriers to people actually doing stuff and getting advice is that they think they have to be wealthy. They think they got to have a lot of money before they can talk to someone. And the reality is that, you know, any time is right, any amount of money is right. Again, you know, the Hatches and the Sharesies, Invest Nows, and so on, allow people to access, you know, what a generation ago would have been a really sophisticated and probably expensive consulting, advising, broking relationship, that today you can do it when you're young. And what's interesting that we've tracked as well is that it becomes different as you get a bit older and as you create more assets. So, you know, the old model was you had to have assets, then you got advice and did whatever you did. KiwiSaver is now ubiquitous. Everyone who works has basically got KiwiSaver, so everyone's an investor. Then you've got platforms. I mean, if you've got $1, you can also go and invest. And so those conversations are happening much earlier, much younger, and then people will dip in and out of the advice relationship depending on their level of requirement, their level of need, what their goals and aspirations are, and so on. And those triggers are kind of really, really interesting to track. So yeah, we're in pretty good stead for the future. But look, bottom line is, and this was the stark piece, without wanting to sound overly optimistic, the stark piece of the research is that overwhelmingly New Zealanders don't have a strong and healthy enough relationship with money, that they don't save enough, that they've only got 3 months, that they don't seek guidance and advice. And yet it's such a fundamental part to making good decisions about how you want to live your life, not because it's the money, but because of what it allows you to do. So that's, really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in an environment of such uncertainty this year, and I think also we probably, as much as I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, and I need hope as much as the rest of everyone else, but I think 2021 is also looking a little uncertain. We don't really know what's coming, even if yay for the vaccine, and I have big hopes for that. You just don't know. And I think getting yourself some stable footing to deal with whatever we've got coming next is really helpful. So if there was one thing that you hoped people could take away from this year and going into next year, is it that sort of the educational side of it? Is it the getting comfortable with it? Where would you start? Or is it something else totally different?
Yeah, look, I think your read is entirely right. I mean, we're all hanging out for Christmas because, hell, it's been a hell of a ride, and it's been a really tough ride. And, you know, we probably all have scars of some type because, you know, human nature is you just move on to the next thing rather than overly reflect on how good, bad, or indifferent. But, you know, we've all suffered loss. We've all suffered trauma. I mean, there's likely to be a bunch of stuff that'll come out in future, but you can't globally go through the sort of year that we've had and not feel and not be impacted and affected. So I think that's really important because that's a well-being conversation. That's a mental health conversation. I think on the money side, look, I think the message on the money side is you're never too early to start, whether it's $1 or $10 or $100 or whatever. The first step is, as with most journeys, Chinese proverb, you know, take the first step. And then that builds confidence. And that was the other part of the research. The more confident, the more informed, the better outcomes people make. Underpinning all of this is the money that comes in and the money that goes out. So understand where it comes and understand where it goes, and treat it with respect, because it is not an infinite resource. It's one to be respected and managed, and that then gives you a gateway into all the other things. And probably the last message on this is, as we started, it isn't about the money. It's absolutely about people. And the better you understand yourself and your relationship with money, so much better will the relationship be into the future.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. Thank you so much. That's Richard Klippen, CEO of the Financial Services Council. Now, if you have questions about this podcast or something else you'd like for us to talk about in a future one, do get in touch. You can find me on Facebook, Francis Cook Journalist, Twitter, Francis Cook, Instagram, Francis Cook NZ. Just pick your favorite, send through those questions, and we'll try to do a future podcast answering it. Don't forget to subscribe to Cooking the Books. You can also find previous episodes on there that might address some of those questions you've got. Everywhere you find podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Until next time, have a great day.